Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I am Monica Hakimi from the University of Michigan Law School, and it's really my pleasure to moderate this panel on the recent invasion in Ukraine, although I think, like many of you, the topic is one that has caused me, at least, great horror and sadness and fear. I have a great group of panelists, and we hope to spend the hour interrogating the question of what the invasion means for the jus ad bellum in particular and for the international legal order going forward. So I will just briefly introduce each of our panelists, and then we will structure the panel more like a conversation than like a series of presentations. So I will ask them a series of questions to get us going. I will hopefully leave some time at the end to take questions from the floor and from those viewers who are watching online. I have an iPad here based on which to accept your questions, and so I'll present them to the panelists, and we can just take it from there. First, I have to my immediate right, Jana Judkowska, who has been a judge on the European Court of Human Rights since June 2010 and has been president of the section since 2017. She is also an associate professor of European and international law at the Bar Academy of Ukraine. On my far left, I have Harold Hangju Ko, who is a Sterling Professor of International Law at the Yale Law School and a former legal advisor to the U.S. Department of State. And to my immediate left, Sabina Rajpal, who is the Assistant Legal Advisor at the U.S. Department of State, who leads the office that provides legal advice to the Bureau of European Affairs. And on the screen, to the far left, and to the far right, I have Yanar Mohammed, who is a co-founder and president of the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, OWFI, a national women's organization dedicated to rebuilding Iraq on the basis of secular democracy and human rights for all. The topic of the invasion of Ukraine could take us weeks to discuss. As I said, we'll focus on the invasion itself and talk about some of the responses to it and the consequences and longer-term implications of it. So Sabina, maybe I could start with you and ask you just to put the invasion in a little bit of context. So there's no real question, I think, that the invasion violates the black-letter rules on the use of force as established in the UN Charter and as in customary international law. It's a blatant and unprovoked act of aggression, as the UN General Assembly has recognized. And yet this is not the first operation that violates or seriously pushes the boundaries of the jus ad bellum. Kosovo and Iraq 2003 both immediately come to mind. But there seems to be a sense that this invasion, at least in some quarters there seems to be a sense, that this invasion is uniquely, if not singularly, abhorrent. And so I want to ask you, is there something different about this particular violation of the jus ad bellum, or is it, as some have contended, just another in a long line of violations? And related, what kind of precedent do you think it sets for the jus ad bellum going forward?
Thank you, Monica. I think while the cases you mentioned or previous examples have involved uses of force where maybe not all observers felt that the black-letter law on when use of force was permissible, was satisfied, I do think that the current case is extremely distinguishable. I think when it came to both Kosovo and Iraq, there was agreement in international institutions that, for Kosovo there was a grave humanitarian situation, for Iraq that there was a certain threat emanating from Iraq. I think those international institutions supported addressing those situations one way or another, as evidenced by relevant UN Security Council resolutions. But here you have the opposite situation. You have a democratic, peaceful government that has posed no threat to the region or to Russia, and you have a completely uncontroversial, unprovoked case of aggression, as you said, that clearly violates the UN Charter. I think the qualitative difference here is really evidenced by the international community's response. I think, sort of looking at the construct of the panel, that the question about the relevance of international law, I think it is extremely relevant, and I think that is exemplified in the response by the international community. I want to acknowledge that given how heartbreaking and horrific the situation on the ground is, that many might feel that international law is not doing enough. It certainly did not prevent Russia from unlawfully invading in the first place. But I do think that the response we've seen shows that international law has a place, that the prohibition on the use of force is still extremely relevant and valid. And I think you can see this by how quickly international institutions have moved and with what unity and purpose, we don't see that often. So also the International Court of Justice, which I know Harold will talk about, has moved more quickly than it usually moves, or even than any courts, I think, generally move. So I think these institutions have showed the importance of the role they can play in responding to such a stark transgression of international law. I think international law has also given us a good framework and language for addressing this conflict. So, as you stated, Monica, it's a clear violation, but I think the rules of international law have provided a way for the international community to come together and condemn Russia's actions. So because of the strong international legal underpinnings relevant to this conflict, the international community was able to unify its messaging from day one. And because everybody's using the same language and operating from the same set of rules and can see very clearly the violation that Russia has committed, the response has been that much stronger. So I think the language of international law has helped focus the international community's messaging and has lifted the discourse above the usual geopolitics. I can pause there for now.
Okay, great, thank you. And Harold. Thank you. And Harold, maybe I could ask you a version of the same question, which is what your take is on the sort of legal implications of the invasion for the jus ad bellum going forward, and just quickly to sort of pick up on a little something that Sabina mentioned. So Sabina mentioned that international institutions have really sort of moved quite quickly in response to the invasion in Ukraine. And I think we do see that, but I also want to ask what you make of the sort of mixed response to the UN General Assembly resolution within Africa and in some sections of the global south, and particularly what you make of China's reaction to the invasion, and what the sort of less robust portions of the response reveal about this invasion and its precedent going forward. For example, what does it suggest about the strength and significance of Article 2.4 moving forward?
So what was distinctive about this event is it's not just the use of force for aggression. This is the use of war crimes, blatant war crimes, as a tool of naked aggression. And they started war crimes from day one, indiscriminate shelling from afar. We now see in Bucha that when they got up close, they tortured people, they bound them. In the case of women, they raped them, they summarily executed them, and they threw them into mass graves. So this is one of the most blatant combinations of atrocity and aggression we've seen in many decades. Now, the most interesting thing to me has been the response, not just among international lawyers, but among the press and others, when we got the order, provisional measures order, which 13-2, that Russia should immediately suspend all military operations in the territory of Ukraine. And the Washington Post, the journal of record in this town, says it's a largely symbolic ruling because the International Court of Justice cannot enforce its own orders. Well, guess what, folks? Not a court in the world can enforce its own orders. And when the Supreme Court of the United States ordered Richard Nixon to turn over the tapes, that was not a symbolic judgment. But as we said in the oral argument, in Marbury versus Madison, it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. And then when the court has said what the law is, it is everyone's duty to enforce it, everyone. We're not operating in a system of simple enforcement where some police force arises. There will be those who help impose sanctions. There will be those who help corporations pull out of their country. There are those who capture the ships of the oligarchs. There are those who help the refugees, et cetera. What have we learned? International law is not usually self-executing. And this is what Ambassador Markarova meant earlier today. International law must rise to the occasion. She said, we are putting our faith in you, meaning that this is a watershed moment for every single person in this room. This is not about Russia versus Ukraine. This is about Russia versus the post-war global legal order. And every single person here should be thinking, am I doing what I can do to help fight for the system that we've got? Because, for example, if China, using its Belt and Road Initiative, is able to buy off countries and get them to abstain on resolutions, and people here aren't doing anything about it, then the system will not work. But if you get an order which says that providing these kinds of aid to war criminals violates international law, then maybe China will back off. And the goal is extremely simple. Make Vladimir Putin an isolated outlaw in an interdependent world. If you make it illegal, then you isolate him. When you isolate him, you force him into diplomacy. When you force him into diplomacy, then the killing can stop. And then there's a possibility of a negotiated outcome, which is what law is supposed to accomplish. And if we as international lawyers can't all contribute to that effort, there has not been a clearer example in my lifetime. If we can't contribute to that effort, why did we go to law school? Why did we study international law? Why are we even at this meeting? It's not about thinking about it. It's about every single person thinking about how can I use what I've learned, the contacts that I have, the forums where I can help to isolate and declare illegal what the Russians have done, and start to find a way out of this slaughter for the purpose of aggression.
Thank you. Thank you. Yanar, let me come to you, zooming in from Iraq, and ask, what's your perspective on the invasion as someone who, and now I'm sort of quoting back to you words that you said to me, is at the receiving end or has been at the receiving end of war. So how do you see the Ukraine invasion relative to what has happened in your country, and how do you see its implications for international law and for the people on the ground?
Thank you, Monica. And I have to say that I've just come from Iraq. I'm in North America now, in Toronto. The implications on tens of millions of people is that their life is destroyed for many generations to come. I remember when the US started the war on Iraq, and we've had a couple of them, not just one. I was a civilian who was living in her home, had graduated from her education and waiting for the right job to start working when the bombs started to fall on our heads. We had 2 American wars on our heads, and the aggressor was different then, but the result is almost the same. Many generations of people whose life was ruined and does not come back in 1 or 2 generations. It takes more. You are a civilian who's living in a country where the whole world looks at that country with one single name, the name of the dictator, which is Saddam Hussein at the time. I feel a little bad for the people of Ukraine, or even for the people of Russia who have been reduced to Vladimir Putin. It's not just one person. And we know very well that once war starts, it will not stay on one side. It will go across to the other side also. Millions of people's life will be ruined. And what can international law do? Is it true that it doesn't do enough? Of course it is true. But is it worth working more on it until it gains ground and it can control the hands of the bullies, not to press the button on the bombing of another country? It's of course worth it. We in Iraq had our lives ruined in 1990 when George Bush, the father, bombed us, and then again in 2003, when the pretext for the war was weapons of mass destruction. And weapons of mass destruction were not found in Iraq, and yet there was no procedure against the aggressor or no punishment for those who had resulted the death of the numbers are to be disputed, but it's in the hundreds of thousands. When we heard of the war on Ukraine by the Russians, of course, the responses in Iraq were different from this side of the world because there is a history of Iraq being attacked by a member of NATO. So there was originally the position that maybe people should not side with those who are with NATO. But it was very confusing because we know what it does to tens of millions of people being bombed overnight and thousands of people being killed within weeks. So we are definitely in Iraq, we are against this war. But then again, the illiberal forces that result from such an, and allow me to use the word, such an imperialist war, the fact that Russia had done it against Ukraine does not negate that it is an imperialist war done for economy and done for political hegemony. So we do feel with the Ukrainians, we feel that we were sitting in their places at some point. We were ruled by a ruler who had his own adventures, political adventures, trying to be that nationalist hero within the region. And eventually our lives were ruined. Tens of millions of people's lives were ruined. And until this very day, we are still struggling to get the most simple rights in Iraq, and we cannot get them. The war was taken in the name of democracy on Iraq. And funnily, in Ukraine, the war was launched in the name of mission of peace, like a military mission of peace. So the names can be different, but the results are always the same. Major loss for tens of millions in that part of the world for the political gains of this group or that group. In Iraq, in general, the left and the right are not, let me say it this way, do not say or put a position against Vladimir Putin because of the NATO war on Iraq that was not resolved, there was no apology, there was no reconciliation with the Iraqi people, and they told us they brought us democracy when they brought the most notorious groups, fighting groups on the ground, and they gave them rule. So in Iraq, the far left, I would say the far right, the militias who are ruling have offered to go and fight with the Russians against the Ukrainians. So we are living in a moment of history where global peace has been disrupted. People in different parts of the world are confused to their political positions, and the people of Ukraine, just like us Iraqis, will have lost their well-being for generations to come. We really feel with them the war, the Russian war on Ukraine has to stop immediately. There needs to be mechanisms around the world that can address it without hurting the people of the country of Ukraine, and eventually it will hurt the people in Russia also. The problem with the wars is that most of the mechanisms, they address the rulers, and they forget that those who pay the price are on the ground, the people. This is what I have in mind at this point.
Thank you. So, Hannah, I'll come to you. Harold and Yanar both spoke of the enormous devastation that is being imposed on the people of Ukraine. And one of the mechanisms that might be available to respond, or at least to hold Russia and Putin and others accountable for some of this devastation are the mechanisms of the Council of Europe. But about 3 weeks ago, Russia ceased to be a member state of the Council of Europe after 26 years of participating. And I think we're curious to hear your views on what this means for the European legal space and why the loss of this particular mechanism might matter.
Thank you very much, Monica. Well, let me start with a little bit Sorry. Thank you. Well, let me start with a bit side remark. You know that 4 years ago, the General Assembly adopted a decision designated 7th of April, this day, today, as International Day on Reflection of Genocide in Rwanda. And it was suggested that the day of reflection, again, today, offered an opportunity to consider the factors that had led to mass atrocity and to renew the collective pledge of never again. Yeah, it's very symbolic. Never again is going on right now. Harold just referred to Bucha, so let's renew our pledge, and we again reflect today on this reflection day on strikingly similar issues, and we reflect actually on how our previous reflections were not sufficient and what else can be done to stop the atrocities. And I speak today, of course, not as a Ukrainian, also as Ambassador Makarova just said in her very powerful speech a couple of hours ago, that we all feel like soldiers in the war. While the last soldiers who are in the army, there are diplomats who are at war, there are us, lawyers, judges, who are also who feels ourselves as soldiers serving the very purpose of the rule of law and, of course, serving our country. But I also speak as an international judge and human rights lawyer, and today, as perhaps many of you, I really question my whole career. And you know, we devoted so much energy into international law, into human rights law. We were so proud of our achievements, which unfortunately turned out to be at least partially illusions. The UN Security Council failed to safeguard international peace and security, the Council of Europe, to which Monica referred, whose mission was to protect human rights, rule of law, and consolidate democratic stability in Europe, unfortunately failed as well. Yes, 3 weeks ago, this major event happened. Russia ceased to be a member of the organization after 26 years. Its flag was solemnly removed from the building of the Council of Europe. It's actually a very powerful video if you watched it. And of course, it was reminding that the governments that signed the European Convention of Human Rights, including Russia, have declared their commitment to fundamental freedoms that are foundation of peace and justice in the world. So 26 years of this document in Russia did not bring, neither to Russia or to the rest of Europe, neither peace and definitely nor justice to Russian citizens. So following invasion of Ukraine on 24th of February, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe unsuccessfully, of course, asked the Russian Federation to cease all the military activities. It was not done, so it decided that Russia committed serious violations of its obligations under the Statute of Council of Europe. And here it's important to mention that the Statute of the Council of Europe distinguished between voluntarily withdrawal of the state from the organization at the initiative of the member state, Article 7 of the Statute, or cessation of the membership against the will of the member state. So in the first scenario, member state should notify the Secretary General, and then the withdrawal takes effect from the next financial year. In this scenario, it would be January 2023. Now, Russia submitted its withdrawal request, of course, accusing other states for destruction of the Council of Europe. In the words of Minister Lavrov, let them enjoy each other's company without Russia. But nevertheless, despite their wish to withdraw, the Committee of Ministers decided that decided the case in the context of the procedure under Article 8 of the statute. So Russia ceased to be a member of the Council of Europe, again, not following its will, but against its will, from 16 March 2022, exactly 3 weeks ago. Now, as a high contracting party to the European Convention of Human Rights, if the state ceases to be a member state of the Council of Europe, still remains a party to the European Convention for the upcoming 6 months. Now, it's till 16 September 2022. It means that the Russian Federation remains responsible for any acts or omissions capable of constituting a violation of the European Convention of Human Rights, provided that they occurred before or including 16 September 2022. And of course, it covers everything that is committed by the Russian Federation in Ukrainian territory. And also in the Russian Federation, I'm sure you know about all terrible restrictions on the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. So Russia is the first state in the history of the Council of Europe expelled from this club of democracies. The Council of Europe was created in 1948, and before that it was the only instance of withdrawal from the Council of Europe. It was Greece in 1969 after the coup d'etat. Again, it was voluntarily withdrawal, the Article 8 of the statute. But there is a huge difference, and huge difference is not because Greece withdrew voluntarily and Russia was expelled. The difference lies in the fact that Greece withdrew immediately after the coup d'etat when military junta came to power. In Russia, the regime stays the same for past 20 years. And it means that the Council of Europe, unfortunately, is partly at least responsible for allowing this monster to grow. And this is something we should seriously reflect upon.
So maybe I could just follow up by asking you to reflect a little bit on it, because I feel like I can't let that go. And so as you reflect on it, as I'm sure you have, how have you thought the Council of Europe might have differently responded to Russia over the past 26 years so as to reduce the likelihood of this kind of occurrence?
Yeah. Well, there's an American legal philosopher, Eric Posner, who famously said that the Council of Europe had presided over a turn of authoritarianship to Russia. This is something very symbolic, which means the Council of Europe perfectly observed what was going on and did not intervene. So for the first time, the question of Russian expulsion from the Council of Europe was raised in 2000 during the Second Chechen War. Then it was in 2008 during invasion to Georgia, then 2014 with annexation of Crimea. Each time the issue was discussed, but nothing happened. Also because many Russian human rights activists asked the Council of Europe that, well, you should not deprive the Russian citizen from their last hope for justice. And the last hope for justice is, of course, the European Court of Human Rights. And then they assured that thousands of the decisions of this court had a very significant positive impact on the Russian legislation and judicial practice. And each time this reasoning somehow was upheld by the bodies of the Council of Europe. But then, of course, in March 2022, the Parliamentary Assembly considered that the positive impact apparently was not so significant to consider Russia as a state truly committed to the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, what we missed, yes, well, during these 26 years when Russia was under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, of course, we were happy with the ratio of implemented decisions. It's true, majority of the decisions and judgments of the European Court of Human Rights were implemented by the Russian Federation. But speaking about not quantity but quality, unfortunately, the judgments that were not fully implemented and enforced touch upon the very core values of the European Convention. Peaceful assembly, freedom of speech, disproportional use of force by the state, in many Russian cases. Also, judgments concerning crimes against civilians during the war in Georgia in 2008, mass violations of human rights in Crimea. And yes, it's a pity that while many other very important for individual human rights issues will not be further reflected upon and will not be implemented by the Russian Federation. But of course, the tragedy of the victims of human rights violations in Russia is not because they can no longer apply to the European Court, but because they have the authorities they have. The sad truth is that the Council of Europe treaties, including primarily the European Convention, also empowered individuals, NGOs. They were instrumental for them to insist on human rights, and they support the civil society in Russia in their struggle for a decent life. And as such, Russia not only will be no longer monitored by external bodies like the Committee of Ministers, for example, but also the relevant local actors, unfortunately, will be deprived of those important tools. And we discuss a lot, well, what should we do with states like this? What should we do with states with clear authoritarian tendencies? Yes, unfortunately, we have within the Council of Europe some others. Should we allow them, should we keep them in this club of democracies and allow them a la carte, approach to the organization's values that would undermine, unfortunately, the authority of the organization and will not protect the democracy? So maybe, well, this time it was a right decision. The only question is if it's not too late. And this is something, it's not up to me, but it's for all others to reflect upon and to consider when there is a point of no return and what should we do with states that go to in a non-democratic way of development.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Harold, I think that sort of nicely tees up the ball again to you. You mentioned the need for action by everyone who is committed to the international legal order and the basic rule of law. And maybe I could ask you then to reflect a little bit more and to tell us a little bit more about the ICJ order on provisional measures, which you mentioned earlier, and how you think that has affected the landscape and empowered different actors to actually take action against Russia and try to hold it accountable, hold Putin and his cadre accountable for their actions in Ukraine.
Well, first of all, let me just say that in the Ukraine case, the team that worked on it is a brilliant and committed team, many of whom are here. And it's just the first step. Let's understand what the strategy is. What is our strategy? And it's really 5 things. Number 1, illegality. Declare Putin's actions and Russia's actions illegal in as many places as possible. 2, isolation. When you've declared somebody's actions comprehensively illegal, they become isolated. They lose leverage. They lose allies. So for, among other things, make it embarrassing for the Chinese and others to openly back the kinds of videos that we saw yesterday of people being slaughtered in Bucha and being left in mass graves. Third, diplomacy. The goal is to stop the killing and to use the isolation of Putin when he starts to realize, I am now Pinochet. I can't leave my country. My assets can't leave my country. My daughters can't take assets out of the country. We can't use our credit cards. We can't move money under the SWIFT system. My oligarchs can't move my money because their yachts will be seized. And that people will gradually start to say, is this really the best way forward? Maybe it worked in Chechnya and maybe it worked in Georgia, but it's not working here. And they've already started to throttle back, and now they are repositioning, and the question is, do they come back and start to concentrate on the Donbass, or are they encouraged through judicial orders and other kinds of pressures enter into a kind of Dayton type of discussion? And then step 4, accountability. Do not take accountability off the table. Civil and criminal accountability must be preserved. You know, Milosevic and Karadzic would have loved to take accountability off the table. At Dayton, they did not do so. They could not do so. And therefore, Milosevic died in The Hague, and Karadzic is in prison in Scheveningen. And then throughout, the 5th idea, information. a brilliant information battle is being fought in the internet, on social media, in which the truth is fighting against the fake news. And that information is gradually getting out. It's being put out by government officials working together. The US government foresightedly declassifying information and getting it out there ahead of the curve. So there are three ideas that we want to keep in mind. Number one, we support an accountability process, and whatever institution can deliver that quickly. And so, for example, there are at least 4 institutions that could deliver accountability: Ukraine courts through their prosecutor and war crimes directorate, neighboring courts like Germany or Poland, the International Criminal Court, where Karim Khan has set up prosecutorial capacity, and 41 countries or so have referred it, and the possibility of a new tribunal that people are talking about. Now, you might wonder, why do we reinvent the wheel when we've got 3 wheels that we're trying to get going? But instead of fighting over these institutions, let's get this accountability process moving. And more than that, let's start developing a private-public archive that can be the basis for accountability. And in this, a question that should be asked right now to Lindsey Graham is, if you favor accountability for Putin, why don't you authorize, with law, sending 20 Justice Department prosecutors with money and intel resources to start helping out at The Hague? And if that's impeded by the Hague American Service Members Protection Act, then authorize it into law by a law passed with Senator Durbin next week. Because if that's what you're interested in doing, then do it. And all of us can push on that. Idea number 2 is Nuremberg will not happen in this format. It is a fragmented Nuremberg. The aggression piece of this is much more complicated because in Nuremberg, everybody was in the dock. Vladimir Putin has 180,000 troops and nuclear weapons. So it's going to be a while before you're able to pursue him on these aggression charges in whatever forum might be created. That doesn't mean you take it off the table, but it means you take the pieces of it that you can take in the order that you can take them. And then the third idea is a slow motion Dayton. We have the Minsk process. We have a process recently convened by Erdogan, not a great Democrat. The real question now is, if you take the ICJ order to the Security Council or the General Assembly this month under the British presidency and start trying to get that order enforced and implemented. You know, yesterday, or this morning, I think, the General Assembly voted by 2/3 to expel Russia from the Human Rights Council, but there were 58 abstentions, which shows that getting things through the General Assembly, even on the Uniting for Peace resolution, is not going to be easy. But the goal should be to get the parties to a table so that there is a ceasefire, so they stop killing people. Because with every week that passes, atrocities are occurring at a rate, and a country is being destroyed. Now, there are many assets in this process. The Ukrainian people are extraordinarily courageous. Their leader is a communications genius. As Sabina said, there's unprecedented speedy cooperation. You know, this is not World War II. We have this network of international law and institutions that didn't exist 75 years ago, and we have the internet. So let's put these together now. So the question is not predicting who's going to succeed. The question is, how do we all work together to make sure that international law succeeds? Which is why at the ICJ argument, maybe the most important point made was, Putin's short game is force. Our long game is law. Let's play our long game and win it. And everybody has to participate on this team.
So Sabina, I'll come back to you. I'd be curious to hear, and I think the members of the audience would be curious to hear how the U.S. government, and therefore the State Department and your office in particular, is navigating this space. So how you are using the institutions available to us to pursue this sort of 5-part plan that Harold laid out: illegality, isolation, diplomacy, accountability, information. Because I understand that all 5 of these are on the agenda of the U.S. government, and so I would just be curious to hearing a little bit more from you about how you keep all of those balls going together and try to institute the coordination mechanisms and devices that you want to really move the ball forward. The single ball forward.
Thanks, Monica. I think, on the illegality point, I would note, sort of jumping off of what Harold had said before, that even if states aren't using military action to, in response to an illegal use of force, there's other ways to police this prohibition on the use of force. So there's a variety of means that the international community is working together to hold Russia to account. Of course, financial sanctions, international isolation, condemnation, visa bans, airspace closures. I mean, there's been really a full whole of government effort, and then, full coordination with allies and partners to see how we can be creative, what tools we can bring to bear to the situation. So I think if you brought in how you view, sort of enforcement of an international law norm, you can see that Russia's violation here is really being responded to by the majority of the international community in a wide spectrum of ways. And I think to Harold's point also, I think we're seeing an interesting moment where international law and morality are aligning and reinforcing each other, because you see actors that might not have legal requirements, like private sector entities, who are pulling out of Russia even if they're in non-sanctioned sectors, or the crews of oligarchs' yachts, walking off the job. So I think you're seeing a lot in the sense of condemning the illegality and sort of working together to isolate Russia. I think going back to what we were talking about the international law framework being so important here, I think that tool has allowed diplomats to work together to really take actions that many countries wouldn't have taken otherwise. So, the U.S. has a robust sanctions program, but a lot of other countries, don't, and a lot of them have enacted new laws to deal with this situation. And that, I think that says a lot. In terms of isolation, Harold's other point, yes, I know, there's concerns about certain countries voting, in different ways, but I think the General Assembly resolution in March was actually quite strong in a sense of only having 5 no votes, including Russia. So, and then today there was the vote to kick Russia off the Human Rights Council. That's only happened once before in the Human Rights Council's history. So I do think the institutions are coming together, and I think we are looking at all of the things Harold mentioned. So the illegality, I think, has been confirmed in many different places, in many different institutions. The isolation's happening. Council of Europe is another good example. The UN, I think there's a lot of mechanisms where there's a lot of focus on isolating Russia. And then diplomatic efforts, I mean, we're seeing, we're trying to support Ukraine as much as we can, whether it's through security assistance, whether it's through the international tools, to give them the best leverage they can have when, at the negotiating table.
And can you just add that it's not just that the crew members on Russian oligarch ship walked off the job. The lawyers for Russia at the ICJ walked off and said, we're not going to defend this.
Yanar, I'll come back to you, and I'll ask you a question of my own, and then start incorporating questions that we're receiving from the audience. So please submit your questions if you have one through the app. So I guess, Yanar, my question for you is, when you spoke initially, you spoke of, the perception of basically the people who have themselves been subjected to this kind of devastation, or to a kind of devastation that might be on some level comparable. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to how you perceive the position of the leaders of your country on the international plane in responding to Russia, first of all. And then second, since you mentioned the point that not all Russian people should be conflated with Vladimir Putin himself, the man, how should we think about separating Putin from the parts of the Russian population that don't support him? Or is that something that international law and the institutions that are available for responding to this crisis are just ill-suited to do, and that we are faced with the problem that either we treat all Russians together or we don't sort of respond to the problem effectively much at all?
Thank you, Monica. You know that I'm like my place in this discussion is a little bit strange because I come from the other side of the world, and I'm surrounded with all kinds of groups who think differently than the Western Hemisphere. I would like to respond to the points that you mentioned, but I would like to connect them with what was mentioned in the discussion. The idea of isolation the idea is that the isolation is for the Russian government and the military machine. We in Iraq had suffered something similar, and it was called economic sanctions. It was sanctioned by the UN and requested by the US and the UK. It is thought that it makes the military machine weaker, but in reality, it starves the people and makes them unable to revolt against their dictatorship rule. My family, all my friends, we suffered, we starved under economic sanctions that were forced by the UN. And the idea was to make the dictator Saddam Hussein weaker. It did not. It just made us weaker to revolt against him. So when isolation is connected with economic sanctions, the people suffer, not Vladimir Putin, not the military machine. So I would worry when I hear something like that. And the other point that I would worry about, and it has not been mentioned in the discussion so far, we in Iraq have lived the aftermath of such an imperialist attack. And the very clear result of this attack was that the most extremist groups on the ground became strong. They had the machine guns in hand, and they eventually ruled the country. They force us to do everything, and women do not have a say about anything now in Iraq. So when you ask about the Iraqi government's position, it's a mix of positions, because on the one hand, Iraq works like that remote state, that remote American state that is told what to do. But on the other hand, there is the Iranian side that is ruling half of Iraq, and it is so much in conjunction with the Russian position, and they are sending militias to support the Russians in their war against Ukraine. The Iraqi government's position on this will not be a clear position. It will be a mix of positions, mixed messages that will not boil down to any clear position. I as an activist, I usually speak and feel the receiving end of these wars. They have taken our destiny away from us. We all had to immigrate to other parts of the world to build ourselves a life from zero. And the irony here is that many Iraqis were on the boats going to Ukraine, trying to cross over to Europe when this war started, and they are suffering like everybody else in Ukraine. So what can international law do within all of this? First, take care of those who are suffering due to crossing the border on foot and at gunpoint. And second is to stress more on diplomacy, more than putting the pressure on the people and starving them, hoping that it affects the military machine. The military machine is the last one to be affected in cases of dictatorship. And I would say about the issues of who's legal, who's illegal, this is a difficult one. You know, Iraq has been subject to 2 American wars that were away from the borders of America. And the debate is that they were illegal. And still, there's nothing that we got out of that. So a lot of disappointment in my talk, but also what we feel on the ground, what they were the priorities should be. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Hannah, I'll come back to you then and ask the question that I think might be implicit in some of what Yanar said, and also follows up on something you said earlier, which is, of course, that the Council of Europe mechanisms are available at least through part of September of this year. And so what might sort of creatively using those mechanisms in the cases that are likely to come before, or to find the cases that ought to come before the Court or the Council of Europe, how might those mechanisms be used effectively to provide for the population as much as possible and protect them, as well as to hold Russia accountable? And also, not how might they be used, so with respect to Russia, but also how might they be used in other Council of Europe states, for example, to deal with the migration crisis that is no doubt occurring in them? Is that something that might be available, or do you think that that is too far afield from where the law is right now to sort of really hold other member states accountable for really providing for and protecting migrants from Ukraine and then hopefully from other conflicts going forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, actually, our court has a long line of jurisprudence related to migration crisis, well, the most recent migration crisis, the past migration crisis. So actually, I think in our jurisprudence, we covered more or less at least the most important points, that most important issues that might create a problem nowadays with a huge migration. I think it's the biggest migration in Europe we observed since World War II. It is estimated that at least 3 million or even more Ukrainians are now, well, actually fled Ukraine and are now settled in Europe. Interestingly enough, no one calculates how many Russians are nowadays escaping Russia, felt suffocated and unable to breathe. I assume there are also huge figures. Many people are unfortunately living the Russian Federation, feeling unable to be there. Now, when it comes to Russian accountability further, yes, as I say, we will examine all the cases submitted to our court related to the alleged violations committed by the Russian government up to 16 September 2022, meaning that, of course, provided that people should firstly exhaust available domestic remedies, what is available in the Russian Federation, I leave you just to imagine, and after that come to our court, which means we will receive the applications much longer than as for 16 September 2022. Now, we all expect that at some day, the sooner the better, we really hope it will happen soon, new democratic Russia will rejoin the Council of Europe, will again ratify the European Convention of Human Rights, and then we will see if the judgment that the court would deliver in the meantime against the previous government, the new Russian government, democratic government, would enforce or not. And I think it's a question for further negotiations, not for today, but I really believe this day will come very soon.
Thank you. Sabina, I'm going to ask you, there are a number of questions about the International Criminal Court in here. Harold mentioned it earlier. And so I guess my question for you is combining a number of questions together, whether the US government might in any way, through Congress or through the executive branch, alter its stance with respect to the ICC, not just for this case, but in a general way that suggests that it is shifting its mode of interaction with the ICC going forward.
So I can say, as you've probably heard, we welcome the ICC prosecutor's announcement to open an investigation. particularly his focus on preserving evidence, which is really where a lot of our focus is right now. As Harold said, there's a number of accountability mechanisms existing and a number being discussed. And I think, this is, again, a conflict where we're seeing so much cell phone footage, video footage, and I think there's a real imperative to try to coordinate and make sure evidence is being preserved. There's foreign domestic courts that can, that have already, I think 10 countries have already opened up investigations. So I think everything's on the table. I'm not going to speculate about any future position on the ICC, but in general, we've welcomed the prosecutor's announcement. We're definitely undertaking wide-ranging efforts to collect, document, preserve evidence, and to assist various accountability mechanisms.
Monica, can I jump in on that?
Sure. I was actually going to ask you to.
So, I worked on the U.S. relationship with the ICC for a long time, and you could think of it as a spectrum. On one end is full cooperation, ratification. That's not happening anytime soon. Ketanji Brown Jackson just got 53 votes. That's 14 shy of 67, and there are other problems as well. At the other extreme, there's demonization and imposition of sanctions, which was the Trump policy toward people who want awards at this meeting. Obviously, that's an absurd policy. But in between, there are two other positions. One is total exclusion or obsessive focus on not a single U.S. soldier ever appearing or ever hypothetically having the possibility to appear before the court, which has been a focus of some U.S. government agencies. And then there is a much more realistic focus, which is on a case-by-case basis, the United States may well find that its national interests fully align with punishment of individuals at the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, is what Lindsey Graham has been saying quite aggressively. Ambassador von Schach is here, and this was something that was discussed at her confirmation hearing. And it seems to me that who in the U.S. government wants to protect Joseph Kony? Who in the U.S. government thinks that Vladimir Putin should escape ICC jurisdiction to which Ukraine has consented and 41 countries have referred? So I think the U.S. position can, within the scope of existing legal constraints, move to this position, which certainly sets the stage for a better policy going forward. There's absolutely no reason for it to be in the demonization camp, which was totally counterproductive. And, frankly, there's no particular reason why it should stay in the notion of worrying about American soldiers in a country where we have a robust system of military justice and hence complementarity, which you would hope would come into play against any example of an American soldier committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide.
Okay, thank you. Well, I see that we are almost out of time and that I have failed to alert you to the CLE part of the program at the beginning, so I'm going to say it now. Right before I wrap up and thank our panelists for this extraordinary discussion. And the CLE point is that any in-person attendee seeking CLE credit must find one of the ACIL volunteers, white ribbon on their badge, and check in. And they must do the same upon departing. So hopefully you did so coming in. If you did not, please do so going out. And you can blame me for not telling you in advance. And for panels where folks are watching live but virtually, CLE recipients will be contacted after the annual meeting to submit a self-certification form. I think with that, I can just say that this panel has been extraordinary.
Oh, Monica, can I just say a word?
Yeah, it wouldn't be an ACIL panel.
On March 3rd, 2020, which was 7 days before the pandemic hit full force, I went to Kyiv to judge the Jessup Moot Court competition, and my hostess was a very brilliant young international law student named Tata Marharian, who escorted me around. And it was a wonderful performance by Ukrainian international law students of the exact case that I had heard argued by American students a week before at a moot court. When the war broke out, I turned on CNN, and there's Tata Maharian, now wearing full military gear. She was on CNN. She's working in a military hospital. And she said to the camera, I'm surrounded by dead children. I studied international law. Where is the international law that I believed in? And I thought, you know, it is the duty of those of us who do international law to give her a positive answer. And the answer was actually at the moot court itself. It was the 25th anniversary of the Ukraine Jessup moot court competition, and all 25 years of winners came back. And we had a gathering, and I asked them, what are you doing, what are you doing? Every single one of these young lawyers was arbitrating against Russia, bringing a case against Russia here, and they said, we are the international law army of Ukraine. And so recently, I saw a Twitter feed from Tata Maharian, and she said, Mr. Koh, thank you for speaking up for the international law army of Ukraine. She said, we will fight here on the ground for a while, but you fight for us there, and we will rejoin the international law army in which we have confidence. By the way, that's the exact same message we heard from the ambassador about an hour ago. And so I think that's a message we should take away from this meeting.
I could not agree more. And I think on that note, we can, and I'll just say that I think I want to thank all of our panelists here for their reflections on this extraordinarily difficult topic. I think I speak for them from what they've said and for others in the room when I say that we are, again, looking with horror, but also with desire for international law to have a real impact in the world. And I take Harold's point that it's up to us to make that happen. So with that, I will just say thank you to all of you for the work that you are doing. And thank you to you for being here.